I thought my mom was a saint until a DNA test revealed she'd have been living the biggest lie of our family's entire existence. What I discovered didn't just change everything I thought I knew about my mother. It shattered the very foundation of who I believed myself to be. Growing up, everyone always said I was lucky to have Margaret as my mom. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for every school fundraiser, never missed a soccer game, and somehow managed to make our modest two-bedroom apartment feel like the coziest place on earth. My friends would come over just to hang out with her. She had this warm, infectious laugh that could fill up any room. But there was always something about my mother that felt almost too perfect, like she was performing the role of the ideal mom rather than just being one naturally. She had these little habits that seemed rehearsed. The way she'd pause just a fraction too long before answering questions about her past. Or how she'd quickly change the subject whenever family history came up during holidays. My dad passed away when I was 12, a heart attack that took him suddenly and left Mom to raise me alone. I remember thinking at the time how strong she was, how she never let me see her break down, even though I know she must have been devastated. She'd tell me stories about how they met in college. It's their whirlwind romance, their small wedding with just a few close friends. But whenever I asked to see wedding photos or hear more details, she'd get this distant look in her eyes and say something like, "Oh, honey, you know how bad I am with keeping track of old pictures." What struck me most was how we seemed to exist in this bubble, just the two of us. While other families had grandparents dropping by, aunts and uncles at barbecues, cousins at Christmas gatherings, our holidays were quiet affairs. Mom would explain that her parents had died young and Dad's family lived far away and weren't very close. It seemed sad but not particularly suspicious to a kid who was just happy to have his mom's undivided attention. As I got older, I started noticing other things. We didn't look much alike. I had dark hair and brown eyes while she was fair with blue eyes. When people would comment on it, she'd laugh and say I got all my looks from Dad's side. But even compared to the few photos we had of Dad, the resemblance wasn't striking. Still, genetics can be weird, right? I knew plenty of kids who looked nothing like their parents. Mom was incredibly protective, almost to a fault. She'd get anxious when I wanted to do normal teenager things like stay out late or go on school trips. Looking back, it felt less like typical parental worry and more like she was afraid of losing control of our carefully constructed world. She'd always have a reason why I shouldn't join certain activities or hang out with certain friends, though she was clever about making it seem like it was for my own good. The most telling thing, though, was how she handled my questions about extended family. I'd ask about grandparents' names, what they did for work, where they lived, basic stuff that most kids know about their family history. Mom would give vague answers or deflect with questions about my day, my friends, my plans. It was subtle enough that I didn't really notice the pattern until much later, when I turned 18 and started thinking about college. I remember wanting to apply for scholarships that required family history information. Mom became incredibly flustered trying to help me fill out forms that asked for things like grandparents' occupations or places of birth. She'd say things like, "Oh, your grandfather did something with cars, I think," or "Your grandmother was from somewhere in the Midwest, maybe Ohio." The answers were always so vague they were practically useless. Despite all these little oddities, I loved my mother fiercely. She was my world, my best friend, my biggest supporter. When other kids complained about their parents, I felt grateful. Mom and I had inside jokes, favorite movies we'd watch together, and this easy, comfortable relationship that I thought was special. She made me feel like the most important person in her life, which, as I later learned, wasn't far from the truth. Looking back now, I can see all the signs that something wasn't quite right. But when you're living in it, when someone you trust completely is managing your reality, it's easy to accept the explanations they give you. Mom was so good at making our small, isolated world feel complete that I never really questioned what might be missing. She'd created this perfect little story of our lives, and I was a willing participant, never imagining that the woman who tucked me in every night and made my favorite breakfast, every birthday morning, was harboring a secret so big it would fundamentally change everything. I thought I knew about myself and our family. The truth is, I probably would have gone my whole life without questioning any of it, if it were for a random conversation with a coworker that would set everything in motion. But at that point, I was 28 years old, and I trusted my mother completely. The idea that she might be lying about something, let alone something major, never even crossed my mind. The first crack in my perfect understanding of our family appeared on a completely ordinary Tuesday in March. I was 28.
Working at a marketing firm downtown.
And grabbing lunch with my coworker Jessica, when she started talking about this genealogy project she'd been working on. She was going on and on about all these fascinating ancestors she discovered through one of those DNA testing websites. Apparently she was descended from some minor European royalty and had relatives scattered across 3 continents she never knew existed. You should totally do one of these tests, she said, waving her phone with some family tree app open. I bet you'd find some cool stuff about your family history. Plus you might connect with distant cousins or something. I laughed it off, explaining that our family was pretty small and boring. Just me and Mom, not much extended family to speak of. But Jessica kept pushing, saying that was exactly why I should do it. That's what makes it exciting. You never know what you might discover. Maybe you have this whole family out there you've never met. That evening, I mentioned the conversation to Mom over dinner. I expected her to laugh about it with me, maybe joke about how we didn't need a test to tell us we were related. Instead, her fork froze halfway to her mouth, and this strange expression crossed her face, something between panic and sadness that was gone so quickly. I almost thought I'd imagined it. Those tests aren't very accurate, she said quickly, not meeting my eyes. Plus, they keep your information in databases. Privacy issues, you know? I saw something on the news about it. It was such an odd reaction that it stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself bringing up family history more often. Just casual questions about her childhood or my dad's relatives. Each time, Mom would give these same vague, deflective answers she'd always given. But now I was paying attention, really paying attention.
Hey.
The more I observed, the more inconsistencies I started noticing. She'd told me her parents died in a car accident when she was in college. But one time she mentioned her mother calling her after she'd graduated. When I pointed out the discrepancy, she got flustered and said she'd misspoken, that she meant a friend's mother. But the way she stumbled over the correction made it clear she was scrambling to cover something up. Then there was the issue of our last name. We were the Johnsons, which Mom always said came from Dad's family. But I started wondering why I'd never met any other Johnsons, never gotten Christmas cards from Johnson relatives, never heard stories about the Johnson family traditions or history. When I asked Mom about it directly, she said Dad's family had kind of disowned him when he married her because they didn't approve of the match. It sounded plausible enough, but something about the way she told the story felt rehearsed. The breaking point came during a conversation about medical history. I was filling out forms for a new doctor and needed information about family health conditions. Mom was giving me her usual vague responses. I think your grandmother might have had high blood pressure, and your dad's family had some heart problems. Obviously, when I asked a simple question that seemed to completely derail her. What was Dad's mom's maiden name? The doctor's form is asking for both sides of the family. Mom went completely silent. Not just pausing to think, but silent in a way that felt heavy and loaded. When she finally answered, she said, Martinez, I think? Or maybe it was Morrison. I can't remember exactly. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. You don't forget your mother-in-law's maiden name. You especially do. And give 2 completely different names and say you coo, and remember which one is right. I pressed her on it, asking how she could be unsure about something like that. And she got defensive in a way I'd never seen before. Why are you interrogating me about this? She snapped. What does it matter? These are just forms. They don't need exact details from 40 years ago. But it did matter, and we both knew it. The conversation ended with Mom retreating to her room, claiming she had a headache, and me sitting at the kitchen table wondering what the hell was going on with my mother. Over the following days, the tension in our house was palpable. Mom seemed nervous and jumpy, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She'd start conversations and then trail off mid-sentence, catch me looking at her and quickly look away. Ask me about my day with an intensity that felt desperate rather than caring. I started paying attention to other things too. The way she'd immediately grab the mail before I could see it, even though nothing interesting ever came addressed to me. How she changed the channel if certain TV shows came on, anything involving families finding each other, or paternity tests. The fact that in all our years together, no one from her past had ever reached out. No old friends had looked her up. No former co-workers had tried to reconnect. It was like my mother had materialized out of thin air when I was born, with no history, no connections, no past that extended beyond our little family unit. And the more I thought about it, the more impossible that seemed. Everyone has a past. Everyone has connections. Everyone has some thread that ties them back to where they came from, except apparently my mother. And now I was starting to wonder if the reason for that was more sinister than I'd ever imagined. The decision to order the DNA test didn't come all at once. It built up slowly, like pressure in a kettle, each strange interaction with Mom adding to my growing certainty that something fundamental about our family story was wrong. The final push came from an unexpected source, my mom herself. It was a Saturday morning, and I was at her house helping her clean out some old boxes in the closet. We'd been working in comfortable silence when I came across a small jewelry box tucked way in the back, covered in dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. "What's this?" I asked, pulling it out. The reaction was immediate and intense. Mom practically lunged across the room to snatch it from my hands, clutching it to her chest like I'd found some dangerous weapon. "That's just some old costume jewelry," she said, but her voice was shaking. "Nothing important." The problem was, I'd already seen inside before she grabbed it. It wasn't costume jewelry at all. It was a small gold locket, the kind that holds pictures. And in the split second I'd had it open, I'd seen a photo of a baby that looked exactly like me. But it wasn't me, because the photo had that vintage quality that suggested it was much older than my 28 years. "Mom, whose baby is in that locket?" I asked as gently as I could. She went completely white. Then she started crying. Not the gentle tears I'd seen her shed at sad movies or my dad's funeral, but ugly, choking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and desperate inside her. "Please don't ask me that," she whispered. "Please, honey, just let it go." But I couldn't let it go. Not anymore. Too many things weren't adding up, and now there was physical evidence that she was hiding something significant. I spent the rest of that day trying to get her to talk, but she'd shut down completely, giving me nothing but I can't, and it's complicated, and some things are better left in the past. That night, I went home to my apartment and ordered the DNA test online. My hands were actually shaking as I clicked the purchase button, because part of me knew that whatever I was about to find out would change everything. But I couldn't keep living with all these questions. Couldn't keep pretending that the inconsistencies in my mother's stories were just quirks or memory lapses. The kit arrived 3 days later, a simple box with a plastic tube and instructions for providing a saliva sample. It seemed almost anticlimactic, considering the weight of what I hoped it might reveal. I stared at it for probably 20 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to follow the instructions and seal up my sample. Sending it off was terrifying. Not because of the physical act of dropping it in the mailbox, but because I knew there was no taking it back once I did. Whatever secrets my mother had been keeping for my entire life were about to be exposed, whether she wanted them to be or not. The waiting was torture. The website said results would take 6 to 8 weeks, which felt like an eternity when you're questioning everything you thought you knew about your identity. I found myself obsessively checking my email, even though I knew it was too early for results. I started researching what different outcomes might mean, reading forums where people shared their own DNA surprises, trying to prepare myself for any possibility. During those weeks, my relationship with Mom became increasingly strained. She could sense something had changed, that I was watching her differently, analyzing her responses to innocent questions. She'd catch me looking at her and ask what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the test. Some instinct told me that if she knew what I'd done, she might try to interfere somehow, or worse, disappear entirely. I started having vivid dreams about possible scenarios. Maybe I was adopted and she'd never told me. Maybe my dad wasn't really my dad. Maybe she'd been in witness protection this whole time, and we were living under assumed identities. The possibilities ranged from relatively mundane to completely fantastical. But they all had one thing in common. They meant my mother had been lying to me about something fundamental for my entire life. The worst part was how it changed the way I saw our relationship. All those sweet memories of her taking care of me, being my biggest supporter, creating our cozy little world, now they felt tainted by the possibility that they were built on deception. Had she really loved me the way I thought, or was I just some obligation she'd taken on for reasons I couldn't understand? I found myself analyzing old photos, looking for clues I might have missed. studying her face for signs of guilt or sadness that I'd been too young to recognize. Wondering if other people in our lives had known whatever secret she was keeping, if I'd been the only one in the dark about my own story. Noticed I was distracted, stressed, not quite myself. When they asked what was wrong, I didn't know what to say. How do you explain that you were waiting for a DNA test to tell you whether your entire life has been a lie? How do you admit that you're not even sure who you are anymore? As the weeks crawled by, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe some secrets are kept for good reasons. Maybe my mother had protected me from something painful or complicated, and I was about to destroy that protection for my own selfish need to know the truth. But it was too late for second thoughts. Test was out there, being processed in some lab, and soon I'd have answers whether I was ready for them or not. The email arrived on a Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. I know the exact time, because I'd been checking my phone obsessively for weeks, and when I saw the subject line, "Your DNA results are ready," my heart started pounding so hard I thought I might actually have a heart attack at 28 years old. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, still in my pajamas, even though I should have been getting ready for work. My hands were trembling as I opened the email and clicked the link to the website. The login screen felt like a barrier between my old life and whatever truth was waiting on the other side. The main results page loaded slowly. Or maybe it just felt slow because every second stretched like an eternity. First came the ethnicity breakdown, which was interesting but not shocking. I was apparently 43% Irish, 26% German, 18% Scandinavian, and 13% broadly Northwestern European. Nothing there that contradicted what Mom had always told me about our heritage. But then, I scrolled down to the section labeled DNA relatives, and my entire world imploded. At the very top of the list, marked as a close family match with 49.8% shared DNA, was a name I'd never heard before. Robert Chen. The relationship prediction said parent-child. But that was impossible. My father was dead, and his name had been David Johnson, not Robert Chen. I stared at the screen for probably 5 full minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be some mistake, some error in the system. Maybe this Robert Chen person was a distant cousin, and the algorithm had miscalculated the relationship. Maybe there was some technical glitch that had mixed up my results with someone else's. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The secret my mother had been keeping for 30 years wasn't about extended family or immigration stories or anything relatively innocent. It was about me, about who I really was and where I really came from. With shaking fingers, I clicked on Robert Chen's profile. He was 54 years old and lived in Portland, Oregon. His profile showed that he'd been looking for family connections, specifically mentioning that he was hoping to find relatives from both sides of my family tree. There was a message option, but I couldn't bring myself to use it yet. I scrolled back up to look at the percentage of shared DNA again, hoping maybe I'd misread it. But no, minus 49.8% was definitely in the parent range. And when I looked at the detailed chromosome analysis, the similarities were undeniable. Whoever Robert Chen was, he was my biological father. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, but I barely noticed. I was too busy trying to process the fact that everything I believed about my identity was wrong. David Johnson, the man whose funeral I'd cried at, whose memory I'd cherished, whose heart condition I'd worried about inheriting. He wasn't my father at all. I called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day in a complete daze, alternating between staring at the DNA results and pacing around my apartment like a caged animal. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. If Robert Chen was my biological father, that meant my mother had been with him around the time I was conceived. Had she cheated on my dad? Had she left Robert for David? Or had the relationship with David come later, and he'd raised me knowing I wasn't his biological son? The locket I'd found in Mom's closet suddenly made perfect sense. The baby in the photo wasn't me. It was probably Robert Chen as an infant, which would explain why we looked so similar. She'd kept it all these years, a secret reminder of my real father, hidden away where no one would find it. Around noon, I forced myself to look at the rest of my DNA matches. There were dozens of them. Chen relatives I'd never heard of. People with names like Jennifer Chen Martinez and Michael Chen and Dr. Patricia Chen. a whole extended family that had been out there my entire life, completely unaware of my existence. Some of them had uploaded family photos to their profiles, and looking at them was like staring into a funhouse mirror of my own features. I could see my eyes in Jennifer's face, my nose in Michael's profile, my jawline in Dr. Patricia's professional headshot. These were my people, my blood relatives, and I'd never known they existed. The worst part was realizing how many lies this revelation exposed. Not just the obvious one about my paternity, but all the smaller deceptions that had supported it. Every time Mom had deflected questions about family history, every vague answer about my dad's relatives, every explanation for why I looked different from both my parents, all of it had been carefully constructed to hide this massive secret. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted and completely overwhelmed. I discovered that my entire identity was built on a lie, that I had a living biological father who didn't even know I existed, and that the woman I'd trusted more than anyone in the world had been deceiving me for 30 years. I kept staring at Robert Chen's profile, wondering what kind of person he was, whether he'd want to know about me, whether he even remembered my mother. Did he know she'd been pregnant? Had he chosen not to be involved? Or had she hidden the pregnancy from him too? There was only one way to get answers, and it meant confronting my mother with evidence she couldn't deny or explain away. The conversation I'd been dreading for weeks was about to become unavoidable. I drove to Mom's house the next morning with printouts of the DNA results clutched in my passenger seat like evidence in a criminal trial. My stomach was churning and I'd barely slept, but I couldn't wait another day. 30 years of lies were about to come crashing down, and I needed to hear the truth from her own mouth. Mom was in her garden when I arrived, kneeling beside her tomato plants in old jeans and gardening gloves. She looked so normal, so innocent, that for a moment I almost convinced myself this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But then she looked up and saw my face. I watched her expression change from surprise to confusion to something that looked a lot like dread. "Honey, what's wrong? You look terrible." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over and held out the papers, watching as her eyes scanned the first page, and all the color drained from her face. She sat back on her heels, pulled off her gardening gloves with shaking hands, and stared at the DNA results like they were her own death sentence. "Where did you get this?" She whispered. "I took a DNA test 6 weeks ago," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I wanted to learn about our family history. Turns out there was a lot more to learn than I expected." She was quiet for a long time, just staring at the papers. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were full of tears, but also something else. Relief, maybe. Like she was exhausted from carrying this secret and almost grateful it was finally out. "We need to go inside," she said quietly. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten thousands of meals, done homework, played board games, had heart-to-heart conversations about everything except the one thing that mattered most. Mom made tea with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the kettle, and I waited. "His name is Robert," she finally said, not meeting my eyes. "Robert Chen. We met in college during my junior year." The story came out slowly in pieces, like she was pulling thorns from a deep wound. She'd been dating my dad, David, on and off during college, but they'd broken up during their junior year, over something she couldn't even remember anymore. That's when she'd met Robert in a literature class. He was smart, funny, kind, everything she thought she wanted at 20 years old. "We dated for about 8 months," she said, staring into her teacup. "I thought I was in love with him. I thought he felt the same way about me. But Robert was planning to move back to Portland after graduation, to take over his family's business. He'd always been clear that his future was tied to his family and their expectations. When Mom told him she was pregnant during their senior year, he'd panicked. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, said his parents would never accept a grandchild from someone outside their community. He offered to pay for an abortion, and when I said no, he just ... withdrew, stopped taking my calls, avoided me on campus. By graduation, it was like I didn't exist to him anymore. I felt a surge of anger toward this man I'd never met. This biological father who'd abandoned my mother when she needed him most. But there was still so much that didn't make sense. What about Dad? About David? Mom's face crumpled. David came back into my life right after Robert left. He saw how devastated I was, and he was so sweet, so supportive. When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't even hesitate. Said he'd raise the baby as his own, that we'd be a family together, but you never told him the truth. I tried to in the beginning, but David said it didn't matter, that biology wasn't what made someone a father. And then you were born, and he loved you so much, and it just became easier to let everyone believe you were his biological son, including you. The betrayal hit me in waves. Not just that she'd lied about my paternity, but that she'd let me believe my entire life that the man who de-raised me was my biological father. That she'd let me grieve him as my real dad when he died, never knowing he'd chosen to be my father despite having no genetic obligation to me. David was more of a father to you than Robert ever could have been, Mom said, as if reading my thoughts. He changed your diapers, taught you to ride a bike, stayed up all night when you were sick. DNA doesn't make a family, love does. But I was too angry to be moved by the sentiment. That wasn't your choice to make. You should have told me the truth, especially after Dad died. I had a right to know who I really was. I was protecting you, she said, finally looking at me with desperate eyes. Robert made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us. Why would I want you to know that your biological father had rejected you before you were even born? Because it was my life, my identity. What if he's changed? What if he regrets his decision? What if he's been wondering about me all these years? Mom shook her head. He's had 30 years to find us, if he wanted to. He never tried, because he probably thought you terminated the pregnancy. You never told him I was born, did you? The silence that followed was answer enough. All these years, Robert Chen had been living his life in Portland, probably never knowing that he had a son walking around with his DNA, his facial features, his genetic legacy. I need to contact him, I said. Please don't. Mom reached across the table to grab my hand. Please, honey. Our family is perfect the way it is. Why complicate things now? But our family wasn't perfect. It was built on lies and secrets and decisions made by other people about my own life. For 30 years, I'd been living someone else's version of my story, and I was done with that. I stood up from the table, taking the DNA results with me. I'm going to write to him, going to tell him who I am. The look of devastation on my mother's face almost broke my resolve. But I'd spent my whole life protecting her feelings, accepting her version of reality. It was time to find out what my own version looked like. Writing that first email to Robert Chen took me 3 days and probably 20 drafts. How do you introduce yourself to a biological father who doesn't know you exist? How do you explain 30 years of secrecy in a way that doesn't sound accusatory? How do you reach out to someone who might not want to be reached? In the end, I kept it simple. My name is Michael, and I believe you're my biological father. I recently took a DNA test that shows we share 49.8% of our genetic material. My mother is Margaret Thompson. You might remember her from college. I'd like to talk with you if you're willing, he responded within 6 hours. Michael, I can't believe I'm writing this. Yes, I remember your mother very well. I've thought about her often over the years, especially wondering what happened after I made the biggest mistake of my life. Can we talk on the phone? And that first conversation lasted for hours. Robert, he insisted I call him that, not Dad, at least not yet. Told me his side of the story with a raw honesty that was both painful and healing to hear. He confirmed what Mom had said about his initial reaction to the pregnancy news, and he didn't try to minimize or excuse his behavior. I was 22 and terrified, he said. My parents had very specific expectations for my life, and I was too immature to stand up to them or take responsibility for my actions. I convinced myself that walking away was better for everyone, but I was really just being a coward. He'd never married, never had other children. He'd built a successful business, traveled extensively, lived what most people would consider a full life. But he'd always felt like something was missing, and now he understood what it was. I've regretted that decision every day for 30 years, he told me. There wasn't a birthday that passed that I did, and wonder if you were out there somewhere. What kind of person you'd become, whether you were happy and healthy. We started talking regularly, phone calls that gradually grew longer and more comfortable. Emails sharing photos and stories about our lives. He sent me pictures of his family, and I could see myself reflected in the faces of aunts and uncles and cousins I'd never known existed. He told me about my grandmother, who passed away 5 years earlier, but who apparently had kept a garden very similar to the one Mom tended so carefully. The most surprising thing was how easy it felt to talk to him. Maybe it was genetics, maybe it was just luck, but we had similar senses of humor, similar ways of looking at the world.
White Colonel Wilson, will remember
I found myself looking forward to our conversations the way I look forward to talking to a close friend. Meeting him in person was surreal. He flew to my city 6 months after that first email, and I picked him up at the airport with my hands shaking almost as badly as they had the day I got my DNA results. But when I saw him walking toward me in the terminal, there was no question we were related. It was like looking at myself in 30 years, the same build, the same way of walking, even the same unconscious habit of running a hand through our hair when we were nervous. We spent a long weekend together, and by the end of it, something had shifted. Not into an immediate father-son relationship, that would have been impossible after 30 years of separation, but into something that felt like the beginning of a real connection. He met my mom during that visit too, and while it was awkward at first, I could see they were both relieved to finally have this conversation they'd have been avoiding for 3 decades. I should have handled things differently, he told her. Should have been braver. Should have stood by you both. I'm sorry it took so long to say that. Mom, to her credit, accepted his apology gracefully. I think she was relieved to finally have the secret out in the open, even if it hadn't happened the way she'd hoped. The hardest part of this whole experience was on learning about Robert, or even confronting Mom about the lies. It was rethinking my relationship with David, the man who'd raised me. Learning that he'd chosen to be my father, that he'd loved me despite having no biological obligation to do so, made his memory even more precious. In some ways, knowing the truth made me love him more, not less. Robert understood this completely. David was your real father, he told me during one of our conversations. I may have contributed some DNA, but he did all the hard work of actually raising you. I'll always be grateful to him for that. Today, 2 years after I first got those DNA results, my life looks very different than it did before. I have a relationship with Robert that continues to grow and develop. I've met my extended family, learned about my Chinese heritage, discovered genetic relatives I never knew existed. My mom and I have rebuilt our relationship too, though it took time to work through the hurt and broken trust. But most importantly, I've learned that family is both more complicated and more simple than I used to think. DNA matters. It connects us to people and stories and traditions we might never have discovered otherwise. But love matters more. David will always be my dad, not because we shared genetics, but because he chose to be. Robert is becoming important to me too, but in a different way, as we build something new together. The truth turned out to be messier and more painful than the comfortable lie I'd grown up with, but it was also richer, more complete, more honest. I know who I am now, in a way I never did before. And while the journey to get here was difficult, I wouldn't trade this knowledge for anything. Now when I look in the mirror, I see not just myself, but the complex story of all the people who made me possible. And I finally understand that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we have to fight to discover.